You've got 30 days to move your livestock, or we'll have you removed by force. I stand on the porch of my grandfather's ranch, land that's been ours since 1952, looking at a woman who's barely been here half a year and somehow believes she can throw me off my own property. Karen Whitfield clutches her clipboard like it's the Bill of Rights. Her bleached hair glued solid even as the Texas wind does its best to pull it apart. The morning air is thick with the clean, honest scent of cattle and freshly cut hay, but it's being drowned out by the overwhelming vanilla cloud she bathed in, straight out of some Bath & Body Works chemical spill. Strong enough, I figure, to knock out a mosquito colony. This isn't some petty HOA issue. This is about 40 acres of ranch land sitting on top of oil rights developers have been circling like buzzards, and Karen thinks she's stumbled onto an easy target. "Ma'am," I reply evenly, "you're aware this is my private property, right?" Her laugh could spoil a gallon of milk. "Not for long, sweetheart. Now tell me, what would you do if a stranger tried to snatch away your family's heritage?" Drop a comment below with where you're watching from. I'd bet your HOA nightmares are just as wild. What Karen didn't realize was that she'd just declared war on a man who spent 15 years drafting the very federal regulations that HOAs have to obey. So let me back up a bit. My name's Garrett Stone. Just 6 months ago, I was living the DC high life, senior policy advisor at the Department of Housing and Urban Development, pulling down 6 figures while writing rules that governed homeowners associations across the country. 15 years of political brawls, hearings on Capitol Hill, and enough coffee to keep a power plant humming. Then Grandpa Joe passed and left me the Lazy G Ranch in Cedar Falls, Texas. Population, about 8,400 on a good day. The kind of town where folks know your business before you do, and the local diner still serves coffee strong enough to wake the dead. Grandpa bought this place right after he came back from Korea in '52. 40 acres of Texas ground with mineral rights, the same ones oil companies have been drooling over for decades. I traded in the cubicle and the bureaucratic grind for a wraparound porch where sunrise turns the fields gold and coffee tastes like freedom. Out here, mornings are filled with cattle calling and meadowlarks singing, beats DC gridlock any day. At first light, I walk the fence lines, boots crunching the same gravel grandpas did for 70 years, the air rich with sage, mesquite, and a peace you can't buy, but paradise doesn't come without trouble. Enter Karen Whitfield, 52 years old, former real estate agent, now self-crowned neighborhood dictator. About 8 months back, she left Dallas behind, bought an $850,000 McMansion in Whispering Oaks Estates, the new subdivision that sprouted up beside my ranch like a migraine in brick form. Within a week, she was campaigning for the HOA board. By the end of the month, she was president. Within 2 months, she was waving that clipboard around like it could summon divine punishment. Picture the type: platinum blonde hair lacquered so tough it could survive a nuclear strike, and a smile sharp enough to demand a manager from 3 counties away. Her uniform of choice? Designer athleisure that probably cost more than a decent used truck, with that clipboard glued to her hand like it was her lifeline. The first violation notice showed up on my door 3 months after I moved in. Apparently, my cattle were committing agricultural nuisances that threatened property values. In her world, the smell of honest ranch work was more offensive than her own personality, which is saying a lot. Never mind that my family was raising beef here back when her subdivision was still wide-open prairie. At first, I laughed. Had to be a misunderstanding, right? Some city transplant who didn't understand rural life. I thought a calm talk over sweet tea would clear the air. That was mistake number 1. The following week, Karen rolled up with her cousin Dale from County Code Enforcement. Both of them armed like paparazzi, cameras flashing, attitudes sour. They photographed everything: the manure pile, Grandpa's old '74 tractor, even my chickens, who looked downright insulted by the intrusion. Karen kept tossing around phrases about researching enforcement options, and that's when the light bulb clicked. This wasn't ignorance. This was a declaration. Karen Whitfield had just chosen a fight with the wrong rancher. She wasted no time raising the stakes. 2 days after her little photo safari, I came home to find a fat manila envelope taped to my front door. Inside was the most official cease and desist letter I'd ever seen outside a courthouse. The letterhead read Whitfield and Associates Legal Services, which I later discovered was code for Karen's kitchen table and a Costco printer. The document itself was a work of fiction dressed up as law. It demanded I immediately halt all agricultural operations, citing health hazards, environmental concerns, and even aesthetic violations. She'd even doctored a survey map that magically showed my ranch intruding onto HOA territory. The audacity was something to behold. And then came the kicker. The notice ordered me to attend an emergency compliance hearing at the Whispering Oaks Country Club. Not invited, summoned. Like I was some criminal defendant instead of a man working land that legally belonged to him. The hearing was scheduled for Thursday at 7 p.m., prime rancher dinner time. Karen knew exactly what she was doing, weaponizing inconvenience. I went anyway. Sometimes you need to see firsthand just how deep the madness runs. The country club conference room reeked of industrial-strength air freshener, trying and failing to cover up the smell of old money and older prejudice. Karen had staged the whole thing like a bad courtroom drama. 12 HOA board members lined up behind a polished mahogany table like judges, and one lonely metal folding chair set dead center for me. A kangaroo court, plain and simple. Guess where they expected me to sit? Karen presided over her little courtroom drama in a navy blazer that probably cost more than my monthly feed bill. She'd even cooked up a PowerPoint presentation, Agricultural Operations Impact on Community Standards, complete with overly dramatic snapshots of my ranch. According to her slides, my manure pile had morphed into a biohazard. My chickens were walking epidemics, and Grandpa's old barn had magically become a blight on the landscape. The coffee they served tasted like it had been percolating since the first Bush administration. "Mr. Stone," Karen declared, her voice echoing against the wood-paneled walls, "you've been summoned tonight to address serious violations of our community covenants." I looked around at the faces staring back, mostly folks from Dallas and Houston. People who'd moved here chasing authentic country charm, only to try scrubbing the place sterile once they arrived. "Ma'am," I said, settling into that hard, folding chair, "I'd like to see a copy of these community covenants you keep talking about." The room's temperature dropped like a rock. Karen's plastic grin wavered, flickering like a faulty neon sign. "Those documents require legal review before distribution," she stammered, shuffling her papers like maybe the answers were hiding at the bottom of the stack. "We can't just hand out proprietary information to outside parties. Outside parties on land my family had owned since before half these people even knew Texas was a state." So I played my card. I pulled out my old federal credentials, sliding my business card across that polished table like I was laying down aces in a poker game. "Well, Karen," I said evenly, "I spent 15 years writing housing regulations for HUD. Maybe I can help you sort out the legal complexities you're struggling with." You could have heard a mouse sneeze. Half the board members suddenly found their shoes fascinating, while Karen's face went through more shades than a traffic light in meltdown mode. Here's something most folks don't realize. HOAs are legally required to provide governing documents to any property owner they claim jurisdiction over. Federal law, Fair Housing Act. Refuse, and it starts to look a lot like discrimination. That's when the twist came. A timid woman, her face kind and soft, like every line told a gentle story, slowly raised her hand like a school kid asking to use the bathroom. "Karen," she said quietly, "didn't you tell us Mr. Stone was just some local rancher?" Karen's laugh could have cracked glass. Anyone can print business cards, Beverly. But the seed was planted. These weren't bad people, just led around by the nose. Now they were wondering what else their fearless leader had. Forgotten to mention, the meeting wrapped with Karen promising she'd provide the documents after proper consultation. Translation, she was scrambling to figure out just how deep a grave she'd dug for herself. As the crowd filed out, that same timid woman, Beverly Chen, a school teacher, found me in the parking lot. The night outside hummed with honesty, crickets singing, an owl hooting in the distance. Sounds that rang truer than anything I'd just sat through in that clubhouse circus. "Mr. Stone," Beverly whispered, glancing around like she was plotting a prison break. "Karen's been lying about everything. Your ranch, her legal authority, even the money." Her voice quivered. "I think she's planning something that could tear this whole community apart." And just like that, I found my first ally in what was shaping up to be the HOA war of the century. Karen, of course, wasn't about to let my little credential stunt slow her down. If anything, it lit a fire under her overpriced yoga pants. Within a week, she escalated into full-blown bureaucratic warfare, a death by 1,000 paper cuts, carried out with the precision of someone who'd run this playbook before. Monday morning kicked off with Dale Whitfield, Karen's cousin, and, apparently, the only county code officer foolish enough to take her side, rolling up my drive in his official truck. The man looked as nervous as a cat in a kennel, clutching a clipboard thick enough to stop a bullet. The complaint? Unpermitted agricultural structures. According to him, every barn, shed, and fence post built since 1952 suddenly required paperwork that had mostly gone up in smoke during a barn fire 2 decades ago. Tuesday's gift came from the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality. Some anonymous caller, real mystery who that might have been, claimed my cattle were contaminating groundwater. The inspector spent 4 hours taking soil and water samples, his face tightening with every clean result. 70 years of responsible ranching stood up just fine, but Karen apparently thought she could summon an environmental disaster out of thin air. Wednesday was my favorite. The state agriculture department showed up to check reports of diseased livestock. They sent Dr. Martinez, a no-nonsense vet who stepped out of her truck, gave my herd a once-over, and asked flatly if this was supposed to be a joke. My cows gleamed healthier than half the folks sipping cocktails at the country club. By then, the diesel fumes from all those government trucks were making my place smell like a truck stop, and I finally saw her real game. Karen wasn't out to prove violations. She was out to bleed me dry. Burden me with inspection fees, legal bills, wasted time, make compliance cost more than surrender. I'd seen this tactic before back in my HUD days. Dirty developers using red tape as a weapon to push out whoever stood in their way. That Thursday, Beverly Chen came flying down my driveway in a dust-spewing Honda Civic, pulling up like she was running from the law. She was shaking so hard her coffee cup rattled against her wedding band as she sat down on my porch steps. My old dog, Charlie, patted over and gave Beverly's shoes a sniff, probably picking up on the storm of nerves rolling off her. "I haven't slept in 3 days," she confessed. Staring at Charlie like focusing on him was the only thing keeping her from breaking down. "I keep thinking about what we've done to you. And I couldn't live with myself if I didn't come clean. She hadn't come empty-handed either." Beverly brought gifts, the kind that could put people behind bars. Text messages, emails, bank statements, a paper trail uglier than Karen's attempt at natural highlights. Turned out, the whole HOA crusade had nothing to do with property values or community standards. It was about one thing: money. Sunset Holdings, the developer behind Whispering Oaks, had been feeding Karen inside info on my ranch for months. They wanted my 40 acres for Phase 2 of their subdivision. And Karen? She was promised a $50,000 finder's fee plus first pick of the premium lots if she could shove me off my land. The entire agricultural nuisance charade was nothing but a smokescreen for legal theft. But the real gut punch was tucked in the stack of HOA paperwork Beverly had smuggled out. As I skimmed through the incorporation documents at my kitchen table, I nearly spit out my coffee, not because it tasted bad, though it could have stripped rust off a tractor, but because of what the papers revealed. "Beverly," I said slowly, setting my mug down, "do you realize what you've just handed me?" She looked like she might be sick. Something bad? Worse than bad. Back in my HUD days, I'd reviewed thousands of HOA formation files. The rules are carved in stone, articles of incorporation filed with the state, covenants recorded with the county, proper establishment before a board can enforce anything. Karen's HOA? They hadn't done a single one of those steps. "Beverly," I said carefully, "your HOA was never legally established. You've all been operating with as much legal authority as my chickens. The blood drained from her face like water through a busted dam. You mean everything we've done has no legal standing whatsoever? I finished. Karen's been running a con job, and she used your neighbors as unwitting accomplices. That evening, another shoe dropped. Dr. Martinez called me back, her voice carrying the sharp edge of someone who'd uncovered something rotten. Mr. Stone, I did some digging after my visit. Your Ms. Whitfield has filed nearly identical livestock complaints in Tarrant, Collin, and Williamson counties over the past 2 years, always targeting rural properties right next to planned developments. Always fabricated. My stomach turned to ice. Karen wasn't just a power-drunk HOA president with a grudge. She was orchestrating a county-hopping scam, forcing farm families off their land, cashing in on developers' rewards, and leaving wreckage behind. And suddenly I had to wonder, how many other grandfathers' legacies had she already erased with her fake crises and counterfeit legal threats? That night, I sat back in Grandpa's old leather recliner, surrounded by Beverly's evidence and the ever-thickening stack of notes I'd compiled on Karen's scheme. Outside, coyotes started their twilight chorus, blending with the low, steady sounds of cattle bedding down. Peaceful noises, reminders of exactly why this land was worth every battle yet to come. By then, it was clear this fight wasn't just about my ranch anymore. Karen had turned harassment into a business model, and who knew how many families she'd already chewed up with her fraud machine. That was when I decided it was time to dust off my old contacts in Washington. If Karen wanted to operate like she belonged in the federal big leagues, she was about to find out what happens when you pick a fight with someone who helped draft the rule book. The real war was only beginning, and sure enough, Karen must have felt her grip slipping, because her next move came straight out of the manipulation handbook. When you can't win on facts, invent a crisis and seize the narrative. Friday morning, I stepped onto the porch and found Channel 7 parked in my driveway, their satellite van blocking my cattle gate like they owned the place. The reporter, a perfectly styled anchorwoman who looked like she'd never been, within shouting distance of livestock, was already taping her. "Opener, I'm standing outside a controversial ranching operation," she said gravely, "that neighbors claim is threatening the health and safety of their children." I sipped my coffee, black and strong enough to raise the dead, and watched Karen orchestrate her show. She'd assembled about a dozen neighbors, complete with kids wearing surgical masks, as if my cattle were spewing bioweapons instead of plain old cow breath. The crisp morning carried the earthy scent of hay and manure, but Karen waved her arms like she was describing a toxic spill site. "This agricultural operation," she told the camera, her voice heavy with manufactured concern, "has been contaminating groundwater and creating unsanitary conditions for months. We've tried reasoning with Mr. Stone, but he refuses to relocate his livestock to a more suitable location." The reporter nodded along. Apparently missing that suitable location really meant anywhere else, so the developers can snatch his land. But here's the funny thing about lies. They buckle under a little daylight. While Karen choreographed her photo ops with masked children, the news crew started interviewing other neighbors. Actual neighbors, old Pete Jameson, whose family had stood alongside mine since the Korean War, didn't sugarcoat a thing. That woman's been trying to drive Garrett off his own land since the day she showed up. The Stones have been good neighbors for 70 years. Now some city transplant thinks she can waltz in and change everything? Then Mrs. Rosa Martinez, who ran the feed store downtown, dropped the kind of truth bomb Karen hadn't prepared for. "Mr. Stone buys all his supplies from us, pays his bills on time, and his cattle are some of the healthiest I've ever seen. If there were really problems, don't you think we'd know about it?" By lunchtime, Karen's media circus was sputtering out faster than a busted tractor engine. The reporter had dug up her real estate ties, her finder's fee deal, and the little detail that she'd barely been living in Cedar Falls a year. By the time the piece aired that evening, it wasn't about agricultural pollution anymore. It was about a realtor trying to strong-arm a land grab with the help of a staged news stunt. But I wasn't about to sit back and watch Karen's reputation crumble under its own weight. No, it was time to go on the offensive. That weekend, I worked the phones like a campaign manager in October. 15 years of drafting federal housing regulations leaves you with some unusual contacts, and more importantly, people who still pick up when you call. I didn't just have colleagues. I had allies who trusted my word. By Monday morning, I had 3 formal complaints filed with 3 different agencies. HUD got a Fair Housing Act complaint framed around discrimination against agricultural lifestyles, something they take dead serious given the national trend of rural harassment. The Texas Real Estate Commission got a fraud complaint detailing Karen's undeclared conflicts of interest and her little habit of harassing landowners for profit. And then came the heavyweight, the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. I spelled it out clear as day: conspiracy to commit wire fraud, mail fraud, and civil rights violations under color of law. Because when you start waving around fake legal documents and forged government letterhead to intimidate families off their land, you're not dabbling in neighborhood disputes anymore. You're playing in federal crime territory. During my HUD years, I'd seen this exact pattern too many times. Fake violations, endless inspections, compliance made so costly that surrender looked cheaper than a friendly offer from a developer. The feds have a term for it: regulatory harassment theft. And they prosecute it hard because it strikes at the core of property rights. Meanwhile, Beverly was proving she was more than just a nervous teacher with a guilty conscience. 30 years of wrangling third graders had made her a natural organizer, and she was quietly building her own coup inside the HOA. By Tuesday evening, she'd met with nearly every board member, armed with evidence of Karen's fraud and the revelation that their entire organization was built on legal quicksand. The emergency board meeting that followed, from Beverly's description, was pure fireworks. She even recorded it on her phone, perfectly legal in Texas, thanks to single-party consent. The next morning, she played me the highlights. You could practically hear Karen's pitch climb higher with every passing minute as board members pressed her on everything: the bogus incorporation papers, her backroom deal with Sunset Holdings, the whole rotten mess. "This is a witch hunt!" she finally shrieked, apparently forgetting that witch hunts don't usually come with hard evidence. By Wednesday, 3 board members had already jumped ship rather than risk criminal charges, and 2 more were openly demanding her resignation. The once intimidating HOA was collapsing faster than a stale biscuit in hot coffee, but Karen wasn't finished. Not even close. Thursday morning, she played her wildest card yet: a call to the sheriff's office claiming I'd threatened her over the phone in some imaginary conversation. She wanted me hauled in for harassment, apparently unaware that filing a false police report can land you in handcuffs. 2. Sheriff Bob Morrison, who'd known my family since long before Whispering Oaks ever existed, showed up wearing the look of a man torn between duty and disbelief. "Garrett," he said, rubbing the back of his neck, "I gotta ask you about this complaint. But off the record, I think that woman's lost her damn mind. It didn't take long to clear things up. I showed him my phone records, no calls to Karen ever. Then the security camera footage proving I hadn't left my ranch all week. Beverly's recording sealed it, Karen's voice practically inventing whole scenarios out of thin air. The sheriff lasted maybe 30 seconds listening to her shrieking before shutting Beverly's phone and shaking his head. "Son, I've seen plenty of crazy," he muttered, tipping his hat as he headed back to his cruiser. "But this one? She's in a league of her own. You just keep doing what you're doing. Call me if she pulls anything dumber." That evening, I settled onto my porch, watching the sun sink low, painting my grandfather's fields in molten gold. The sage carried on the breeze, mingling with the steady lowing of cattle. Peaceful, worth fighting for. Karen had tried every trick: legal intimidation, bureaucratic harassment, staged media outrage, even fake police reports. But she'd made one fatal miscalculation. She thought I was just another rancher too stubborn to know the law. Tomorrow, she was going to learn what it meant to square off against the man who'd helped write the law. And the lesson wasn't going to be gentle. Saturday morning brought Beverly Chen back down my dirt driveway, only this time she wasn't trembling with guilt. She was buzzing with anger. She dropped a banker's box onto my kitchen table with the slam of someone delivering the final nail in a coffin. "Garrett, you need to see this." Inside were manila folders stuffed with financial ledgers and bank statements. Her smile was grim. "Karen made one mistake," Beverly said, pulling out a stack of records. She trusted me to handle the HOA bookkeeping because teachers are good with numbers. Grandfather's ranch. Generational farms, family homesteads, all sacrificed at the altar of Karen's greed and some developer's land grab. "Beverly," I said, staring at the mountain of evidence she'd dropped on my table, "do you realize what you've just handed me?" She gave a sharp nod. "Enough to put her in federal prison for a very long time." The balance of power had just flipped. Karen thought she was bullying a backwoods rancher too stubborn or too ignorant to fight back. Instead, she'd set her sights on someone with federal connections, 15 years of regulatory muscle, and now a paper trail proving systematic fraud across multiple counties. And this wasn't about settling a personal score anymore. This was about justice for every family she'd already robbed, and for the ones she hadn't reached yet. Karen had turned harassment into a business plan, and that plan was about to be burned to the ground. I leaned back in Grandpa's old kitchen chair, surrounded by evidence of corruption that stretched far beyond Cedar Falls. Sunlight streamed through the windows that had watched 3 generations of Stones sip coffee before heading out to tend the land. This ranch had weathered the Depression, 2 wars, drought, and floods. It would survive Karen Whitfield, too. But not before I made some phone calls to the federal agencies that treat housing fraud like blood in the water. Karen had picked the wrong opponent, and she was about to learn that some battles leave scars that never fade. This war wasn't just a fight anymore. It was about to become a rout. By Sunday morning, my house had transformed into a war room. Beverly had rallied reinforcements. Jim Patterson, a retired electrician with a knack for detail, and Maria Santos, a paralegal who knew legal codes like most folks knew scripture. My kitchen table was buried under folders, scribbled notes, and enough coffee to keep a platoon upright. The air smelled of fresh brew and righteous fury. And believe me, nothing's more dangerous than decent people who finally realize they've been conned. "Here's the plan," I said, laying Beverly's financial records across the table like blueprints for battle. "We've got 3 goals. Stop Karen from wrecking more lives, get justice for the ones already ruined, and make sure this scam dies here in Cedar Falls." Jim leaned back, arms crossed, wearing the expression of a man who'd finally found the right tool for the toughest job. "What do you need from us?" The legal strategy was clear, but the timing had to be surgical. I'd already roped in Jim Rodriguez, a local real estate lawyer whose grandfather used to buy cattle from mine. Rodriguez usually stuck to title disputes and property lines, but once I explained Karen's con, he was all in. More importantly, he had contacts inside the state attorney general's office and knew exactly how to sync with federal investigators. The financial approach was where Beverly's teaching instincts turned into our secret weapon. She cataloged every fraudulent transfer like a stack of overdue homework, line by line, annotated and cross-referenced. By the time she finished, we didn't just have evidence. We had a syllabus of Karen's crimes that would make a federal prosecutor clear their calendar, but paper trails alone wouldn't be enough. We had to move fast, freeze the HOA's accounts before Karen drained them, lock down assets before she shifted ownership, and hit the courts with emergency injunctions that tied her hands before she realized just how cornered she really was. Still, the real battlefield wasn't the banks or the courthouse. It was the community. Karen had thrived by isolating people, keeping her victims too ashamed or intimidated to speak out. That ended now. We needed to flip the narrative, shine daylight on her scam, and rally the entire town behind the truth. "Here's something most folks don't know," I told the room, pulling out my old HUD training binders. Systematic housing fraud isn't just theft from individuals. It undermines the entire foundation of property rights. And Washington takes that seriously. The RICO statutes were the hammer. Prove a pattern of organized fraud, and the law didn't just take down Karen, it swallowed her whole network. Developers, co-conspirators, anyone profiting off her schemes. Better still, RICO cases carried mandatory asset forfeiture. That meant we could claw back stolen money and return it to every family she'd cheated, not just the ones in Cedar Falls. Maria, head bent over her notes, didn't even look up when she asked, "What about statute of limitations? Some of those thefts go back more than a year." 2 years for housing discrimination, I said. But fraud? If the scheme's still active, there is no clock. And she's still gunning for my ranch, which means the clock hasn't even started. Assignments fell into place like clockwork. Beverly. Keep the financial pipeline airtight and record. Karen's desperate calls and threats. Jim. Line up the remaining board members to strip Karen of authority and dissolve the HOA shell she'd been hiding. Behind Maria. Work with Rodriguez to file for injunctions, asset freezes, and if we were lucky, criminal referrals. Me? My job was threading the needle. Quietly bringing in federal agencies without spooking Karen into torching evidence or leaning on witnesses. One thing HUD had taught me, never tip your hand too soon. Targets who caught wind of federal scrutiny went feral, destroying files, intimidating neighbors, vanishing offshore. We needed Karen overconfident, still scrambling, still sloppy. The deeper she dug, the tighter the noose got. And I knew exactly where to take the evidence. HUD would handle the fair housing violations. But the bigger fraud, the wire transfers, the falsified mailings, the interstate conspiracy, that belonged to the FBI. And the FBI loved cases like this. Clean paper trails, sympathetic victims, and a defendant arrogant enough to think she could outsmart federal law. The IRS would have a field day with Karen's unreported finder's fees, and the state attorney general could line up with federal prosecutors for a RICO case. One more thing, I said, tapping a legal pad full of numbers. We needed to reach every other family she'd victimized. Their testimonies wouldn't just demand justice, they'd prove the pattern of criminal conduct we needed for federal charges. Beverly's face went thin. What if they're too scared to come forward? Karen already ruined them once. That's where federal resources come in, I told her. Witness protection, victim compensation, pro bono legal help. The feds have tools most people never hear about. These families won't be alone. By noon, our plan looked surgical. Phase 1. Quietly coordinate with law enforcement and keep collecting evidence. Phase 2. Simultaneous legal strikes, criminal referrals, civil suits, emergency injunctions, asset freezes. Phase 3. A public exposure that would destroy Karen's ability to operate anywhere in Texas. Timing was everything. Move too fast and she might burn the paper trail or flee. Move too slow and she could hit more families or siphon funds out of reach. We needed federal agents, state prosecutors, local cops, investigative reporters, and civil litigators all synchronized. One well-oiled machine. Jim Rodriguez agreed to file for preliminary injunctions by Tuesday to freeze Karen's accounts and block access to HOA funds. Beverly would present the embezzlement evidence at Wednesday's emergency board meeting to strip Karen of any authority. Maria would coordinate with the state AG's office to kick off criminal proceedings. I'd be making targeted calls in Washington to the people who specialize in this kind of organized housing fraud. Karen had turned rural land theft into a business. She'd picked on me because she assumed I was just another victim who didn't know his rights. Instead, she tangled with someone who'd spent 15 years building the federal programs meant to stop crooks like her. By Wednesday afternoon, we'd know whether Karen was smart enough to fold quietly or arrogant enough to keep fighting a battle she'd already lost. Either way, the families she'd already destroyed would get their day, and her theft operation was about to be dismantled for good. Then Monday arrived, and with it, a level of desperation from Karen I honestly hadn't expected. Karen's next move was pure desperation. She hired a private investigator, a greasy operator named Rick who looked like he'd learned detective work from late-night crime dramas, to dig up dirt on my federal career. She must have imagined she'd uncover some scandal she could wave around to discredit me before I exposed her. Instead, Rick found 15 years of spotless service records, commendations from 3 different HUD secretaries, and glowing statements from families whose housing discrimination cases I'd helped resolve. By the 3rd day, Rick looked more like a man questioning his life choices than an investigator on the trail of a scandal. The worst thing he unearthed was my 2019 parking ticket. But Karen didn't stop humiliating herself there. On Tuesday, she tried to poison my standing with county officials by floating rumors that I'd taken bribes during my federal years. She even phoned Commissioner Williams, a man whose family had known mine for 3 generations, insinuating that my grandfather's ranch had been bought with dirty government money. Williams called me that afternoon, laughing so hard he could barely breathe. "Garrett," he chuckled, "that woman just asked if your granddaddy was a federal criminal. I told her Joe Stone was the most honest man in 3 counties, and if she keeps dragging dead war veterans into her lies, I'll make sure everyone knows exactly what kind of person she is." The stench of Karen's panic was stronger than her vanilla perfume, and it was about to get worse. Wednesday night brought her boldest stunt yet. At around 2 a.m., I woke to the sound of spray cans rattling outside my front fence. My security cameras, installed after her earlier harassment, captured everything in crisp night vision. Karen and an accomplice in dark clothing scrawling "health hazard" and "toxic waste dump" in bright red across fence boards that had stood for decades. The audio was even better. Karen's voice, unmistakable even in a whisper, plotting how the graffiti would prove her insurance claims and bolster her media narrative. She was literally manufacturing the very property damage she'd been blaming on my ranch. Then came Thursday morning and her most audacious falsehood yet. She filed police reports claiming I'd threatened her during phone calls that never existed, complete with transcripts straight out of a bad action movie. Sheriff Morrison showed up at my door looking equal parts obligated and irritated. "Garrett," he said, "I've got to ask you about these alleged calls, but I already ran your phone records against her timeline. Unless you figured out how to be in 2 places at once. This woman's lying through her teeth." I pulled up the security footage showing Karen vandalizing my fence just hours earlier, along with Beverly's recordings of HOA meetings where Karen openly plotted final solutions for the ranch problem. Sheriff Morrison barely made it 30 seconds into the video before shaking his head in disgust. "That woman's managed to rack up more crimes this week than most folks commit in a lifetime," he muttered, copying the files onto his department laptop. "False reports, vandalism, conspiracy to commit fraud. She's going to be real popular down at the county jail." I asked him to hold off on arrests a little longer. My federal contacts needed Karen to keep digging her own hole so they could document the full scope of her operation, and premature charges at the county level might complicate the bigger case. Meanwhile, Beverly was stirring up her own storm inside what was left of the HOA board. Thursday's emergency meeting, secretly recorded of course, was in her words, a masterpiece of controlled chaos. Karen walked in expecting to whip up support for her latest manufactured crisis, striding around in a navy blazer like she was about to brief the United Nations. Instead, she walked into a firing squad of fed-up neighbors who'd finally had enough. She opened with a whole speech about escalating threats from your ranch and the need for more protective measures. Beverly told me later, her voice still shaky with adrenaline. Then Jim Patterson stood up and asked her about the missing $127,000. The recording captured Karen's meltdown in 3 acts. Denial, "I don't know anything about missing money." Deflection, "Beverly must have miscalculated." And finally, wild attacks, "You're all jealous of my success?" The climax came when Maria Santos calmly asked her to produce proof of HOA incorporation and legal authority. Karen doubled down, demanding loyalty and urging everyone to stop undermining her leadership during difficult times. That's when Jim Patterson hit play on my recording, explaining the HOA had never been legally established. Beverly said Karen's face at that moment was priceless, like someone watching the ground open up beneath them. By Friday morning, the board had unanimously dissolved the sham HOA, stripping Karen of any position of power and voting to forward their evidence to the authorities. Karen's response? A flurry of threatening emails promising lawsuits and serious consequences for their betrayal. Every one of those emails landed in Sheriff Morrison's inbox within an hour, adding witness intimidation to her expanding rap sheet. The woman was imploding faster than a fireworks factory, and every frantic move gave prosecutors more ammunition. By Friday evening, the most telling sign yet appeared that Karen knew her empire was collapsing: Rick the PI. Rick showed up at my ranch looking like a man who'd rather be swallowed by the earth than stand on my porch. He came offering to trade information on his own client in exchange for a little protection from prosecution. Turns out Karen had asked him to plant evidence on my property. Drugs, stolen goods, anything she could use to justify a search warrant and eventual seizure. Rick had refused, but not before hitting record on their conversation. On tape, Karen offered him $10,000 to find something that would stick. Another felony to tack onto her growing list. And more proof her campaign was planned and deliberate, not some heated neighborhood dispute. That night I sat on my porch, letting the cool air and the sound of lowing cattle wash over me while coyotes sang out in the distance. The breeze smelled of sage and fresh grass. Clean, honest, nothing like the poisonous atmosphere Karen had tried to conjure with her lies. She'd run the full gauntlet now: legal intimidation, media manipulation, vandalism, false police reports. Each desperate move had only handed us more ammunition. Come Monday morning, she was about to learn what happens when all that evidence gets dropped into the laps of federal agencies built to prosecute exactly this kind of organized criminal enterprise. And I had a feeling the lesson would be educational for everyone watching. Karen's last move was so brazen, it almost impressed me, like watching a tornado for its sheer destructive ambition. Monday dawned with what looked like federal agents at my door, official-looking badges, windbreakers, and an emergency health department closure order that might have fooled a lot of people. The lead man was middle-aged, sweating through a cheap suit that screamed regional dinner theater, while his partner had the stiff awkwardness of someone who'd learned government protocol from YouTube tutorials. They presented paperwork declaring my ranch an immediate public health risk, requiring the evacuation of all livestock within 24 hours. Mr. Stone, the fake agent intoned, reading from a script so bad even community theater would have turned it down. This property has been determined to pose a significant threat to community health and safety. You have 24 hours to relocate all agricultural operations or face federal prosecution. The documents were a work of art, embossed seals, polished letterhead, even fake EPA registration numbers. Karen had gone all in, hiring actors and paying for professionally forged government papers. She was stacking up federal felonies like poker chips just to prop up her crumbling charade. But here's the thing about spending 15 years writing federal regulations. You learn exactly how real government documents look, how actual agents talk, and which agencies have jurisdiction over what. These two were about as authentic as a $3 bill. Gentlemen, I said evenly, making sure every word was captured by my security cameras. Perhaps you can tell me which exact federal statute gives the EPA authority to shut down a privately owned agricultural operation. The lead agent flipped through his stack of counterfeit paperwork like a kid bluffing his way through an oral exam. Under the Federal Emergency Health Protection Act. There is no Federal Emergency Health Protection Act, I cut in smoothly. I'd know. I helped draft half the housing and environmental regulations you're pretending to enforce. I held up my phone as if preparing to make a call. And your federal credentials, please, for verification. Both actors immediately began sweating like roofers in August. The woman kept darting panicked glances at her partner, the expression of someone realizing she'd wandered into a minefield. Mr. Stone, the man croaked, his voice cracking. We don't have time for bureaucratic delays. This is a public health emergency requiring immediate action. What they didn't know was that real federal agents were hidden in multiple positions around my property, recording every second of this farce. My calls to Washington on Friday had triggered a multi-agency task force, and by Saturday they'd been watching Karen's little circus. Now the fake raid was being documented by actual federal officers who were probably wondering if criminals had always been this dim-witted. I decided to lean into the performance. Well, I said, if this truly is a federal emergency, I'd better loop in my old friends at HUD to coordinate. Let me just call Assistant Secretary Johnson. The panic that flashed in both actors' eyes was priceless. They began edging back toward their rental car like people backing away from a hornet's nest. Actually, Mr. Stone, the woman stammered, there may have been, an error in our paperwork. We should probably return to headquarters for clarification. Oh, don't rush off on my account, I replied cheerfully. My federal contacts would be thrilled to meet you and go over the proper emergency response protocols. They were gone in 30 seconds. Doors slammed. Gravel flying. probably calculating how much prison time comes with impersonating federal agents. But Karen wasn't finished with her show. Within the hour, she was on social media bragging about her successful federal intervention, complete with staged footage of my ranch supposedly being evacuated by government order. She'd filmed the actors handing me their fake documents and was now using the footage as proof that federal authorities had validated her campaign. The Facebook post was pure Karen victory. Federal agents have finally taken action against the agricultural nuisance threatening our community. Property values protected. Our children are safe. Real leadership gets results. She was literally celebrating a felony as if it were her crowning achievement. Blissfully, unaware that actual federal agents were archiving every word for her prosecution. That afternoon, Beverly drove out to my ranch carrying recordings from an emergency HOA meeting where Karen had been parading her supposed federal triumph before the remaining residents. In the audio, Karen proudly displayed the footage of her fake agents, bragging that she had personally coordinated with Washington to safeguard the community. She's completely detached from reality now, Beverly said, her tone a blend of disbelief and genuine worry. At this point, she's convinced herself she's been running an undercover operation with the feds for months to take you down. The tapes were devastating. Karen spinning stories about high-level contacts in federal agencies, inventing meetings with government officials, even quoting imaginary conversations with senators about the Cedar Falls agricultural crisis. Each lie was another count of fraud and another nail in the coffin for federal prosecutors. But the real disaster hit that evening. Karen arrived at my ranch with her cousin Dale and 2 other men, claiming they were there to assist with the voluntary livestock evacuation supposedly ordered by federal authorities. My security system caught every frame in high definition, Karen directing her helpers to open the cattle gates, her voice clearly audible as she ordered them to help the federal process by releasing my livestock onto public roads. It was an attempted theft of my herd, cloaked in the language of government action. That's when Sheriff Morrison rolled up with backup units, apparently tipped off about suspicious activity at my property. The sight of squad cars sent Karen's crew scattering like startled birds, leaving her standing alone by the cattle gate with the expression of someone who had just realized the game was over. "Karen Whitfield," Sheriff Morrison said as he stepped from his patrol car, sounding like a man finally bringing a long ordeal to an end. "You're under arrest for criminal conspiracy, livestock theft, impersonating federal agents, and about 6 other felonies we're still tallying." The click of the handcuffs was a sound I'd been waiting to hear. Justice served with a side of poetic irony. After months of trying to frame me with false charges, Karen was going to jail for the very real crimes she'd committed in full view of multiple cameras. Even as Sheriff Morrison read her rights, Karen shouted about federal authority and government conspiracies, still clinging to the fantasy she'd built as it collapsed like a house of cards in a hurricane. That night, I sat on my porch again, listening to the soft, steady noises of my cattle settling in the pastures and the distant calls of coyotes across land that had once more endured an assault on its integrity. The air smelled clean and honest, free of the toxic atmosphere Karen had tried so hard to create with her long campaign of lies and harassment. Karen had played every card she had: legal intimidation, bureaucratic stunts, media spin, false police reports, vandalism, and finally, outright fraud with her army of fake federal agents. But every reckless move had only added more fuel to the federal case building against her. Evidence layered so high it was now impossible to ignore. Tomorrow would bring the confrontation that ended her scheme for good. And I knew one thing with certainty. Karen Whitfield was about to learn that some battles leave scars you carry for the rest of your life. Tuesday evening brought the grand performance. She'd been rehearsing in her own mind, a town hall meeting she called to celebrate the so-called federal victory over my ranch. The Cedar Falls Community Center was overflowing, every folding chair filled, the aisles packed with neighbors, reporters, and, though Karen didn't realize it, federal agents stationed like chess pieces throughout the crowd. That morning, she'd posted bond, apparently convinced her arrest had been nothing more than a minor bureaucratic hiccup. In her mind, the charges weren't a humiliation, but proof of her importance, the price of bold leadership. Her ability to turn reality into delusion was almost impressive. The community center buzzed with nervous anticipation. The air, thick with the smell of burnt coffee and folding chairs, scraped into neat theater-style rows. On stage, Karen had arranged her props: a lectern, a projector, and a carefully rehearsed PowerPoint. She wore a sharp navy blue suit that screamed authority, striding across the stage with the smug posture of a general returning from war. "Ladies and gentlemen," Karen began, her voice ringing against the cinderblock walls with the assurance of someone drunk on their own press releases. "I called this meeting tonight to share wonderful news about protecting our community's future." She clicked to her first slide. "Federal intervention. Success story." The words plastered across a photo of my ranch. The irony was thick enough to choke on. Through persistent advocacy and coordination with federal authorities, we finally addressed the agricultural nuisance that threatened our property values and our children's health, she declared, apparently blind to the fact that half her audience was law enforcement. That's when Beverly Chen rose to her feet from the middle row, her voice slicing through the room. "Karen, could you explain why you were arrested yesterday for conspiracy and fraud?" The atmosphere dropped 10 degrees in an instant. Karen's smile flickered like a candle in the wind, but she forced her way forward, desperation sharpening her tone. "That was nothing more than a bureaucratic misunderstanding," she insisted, her voice climbing higher than before. "Federal operations often require discretion, something local authorities don't always understand." But Beverly wasn't finished. "Could you also explain the missing $127,000 in community funds?" The murmur that rolled through. The crowd was electric, like current through water, charging the air with suspicion and the crackling sense that the show was almost over. Karen's face went through more shades than a West Texas sunset, flushed red, pale white, blotched purple, but she clung to her script like a drowning woman to driftwood. "Those were legitimate operational expenses," she stammered. "Legal fees, investigation costs, federal coordination." That's when I rose from the back of the room. Every head turned, the sudden silence cutting her words short. Karen's expression shifted in an instant, from smug control to raw terror. "Karen," I said, my voice carrying cleanly across the cinderblock hall, "would you like to explain to everyone here about your finder's fee arrangement with Sunset Holdings?" Her jaw worked uselessly, opening and closing like a fish gasping on dry land. She hadn't expected me to show up at her victory parade. I don't know what you're talking about," she managed. I started walking down the center aisle, the crowd parting for me like the Red Sea. "Then maybe we should discuss the 6 other families whose land you helped steal. Same scheme every time. The fake HOA authority, the forged documents, the intimidation." Karen backed away from the podium like it had turned venomous. You're just trying to discredit me because you know I've exposed your illegal operation." I reached the stage and calmly took the microphone from her trembling hands. "There's something these good people need to know about their so-called HOA president." The projector clicked, but instead of her carefully polished PowerPoint, Beverly's evidence filled the screen. Bank transfers showing embezzlement, text chains with developers arranging payouts, photos of Karen spray painting my fence, audio clips of her hiring actors to pose as federal agents. The room reacted like a storm surge breaking loose. Gasps, angry shouts, neighbors turning on each other with expressions of disbelief and betrayal. These were families who had trusted Karen with their homes, their money, their futures, only to learn she'd been robbing them blind while selling them out to developers. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said, steady over the rising noise, "Karen Whitfield isn't your HOA president. She's a career con artist, running systematic fraud operations across Texas, stealing land, destroying families, and collecting kickbacks from developers every step of the way." That's when Special Agent Martinez of the FBI stood up from the third row. His badge glinted under the fluorescent lights as he raised his voice. "Karen Whitfield, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, mail fraud, and violation of civil rights under color of law. the community center erupted, reporters snapping photos, agents moving in, neighbors shouting questions about their missing money, and in the center of it all, Karen froze as handcuffs clicked around her wrists for the second time in 2 days. No more fake authority. No more staged crises. No more polished lies in a designer suit. Her empire of fraud had collapsed, this time in front of the very people she'd sworn she was protecting. Just the clink of handcuffs and the long walk of shame past neighbors, who finally saw through her lies. "This is a conspiracy," Karen shrieked as agents guided her toward the doors. "He's connected. He's corrupt. This is all about protecting his illegal operation." Agent Martinez stopped at the threshold, turned back, and spoke with the calm weight of authority. "For the record, Mr. Stone's ranch has been inspected by multiple agencies and found fully compliant with every federal, state, and local regulation. Ms. Whitfield, on the other hand, has been under federal investigation for systematic housing fraud spanning multiple counties." The room went still. Then old Pete Jameson, whose family had known mine for 3 generations, stood and called out, his voice ringing with plain-spoken truth. "Garrett, we owe you an apology. That woman damn near tore this town apart with her lies." But the most powerful moment belonged to Beverly Chen. She stepped to the microphone as Karen disappeared in cuffs, her voice steady with conviction. "I want everyone here to understand, Garrett Stone didn't just defend his ranch. He saved this community. He could have stayed quiet, but instead he exposed the truth. For all of us." As folks filed out into the warm Texas evening, the conversations had shifted. Neighbors compared notes about Karen's schemes, talked about rebuilding the HOA properly, and even made plans to reach out to other families who'd been targeted by similar scams. The scent of sage and mesquite drifted through the open doors, blending with the low murmur of honest voices reclaiming their town. Karen Whitfield's empire of fraud was finished. Justice had landed with the full weight of federal law, but something more important had happened too. A community had learned to spot corruption before it could take root and to stand together against it. The war was over. Truth had carried the day. And Karen would have plenty of quiet years in a federal cell to reflect on why you don't pick fights with people who understand how the system really works. 6 months later, I sat on my grandfather's porch, coffee in hand, watching the sunrise pour gold across 40 acres of land no developer would ever touch. The air smelled of cattle, sage, and freedom, untainted, honest. Eternal, Karen Whitfield was now inmate to 54873, serving 15 to 20 years after pleading guilty to a criminal roster that read like a law school syllabus: wire fraud, mail fraud, conspiracy, civil rights violations, impersonating federal officers, and, my personal favorite, violating the RICO Act by running a systematic criminal enterprise. Turns out the government doesn't take kindly to folks who turn land theft into a business plan, and the recovery, better than we'd dreamed. Every stolen dollar traced, every victim compensated, every fraud unraveled. This land had weathered the Depression, wars, droughts, and floods. And now it had survived Karen Whitfield. Federal asset forfeiture clawed back more than $2 million in stolen money and unlawfully obtained property, which was redistributed to Karen's victims across several counties. Families she'd already devastated not only got restitution, but damages for the hell she'd dragged them through. Justice served, with a bonus check attached. As for Sunset Holdings, the development company bankrolling her schemes, their federal contracts worth over $200 million evaporated overnight, and within 3 months, they were filing bankruptcy papers. Turns out systematic housing fraud isn't exactly the kind of thing that keeps you in Uncle Sam's good graces. Their Texas branch has been shut down for good, and the executives now have their own stack of federal indictments to deal with. But the true victory wasn't financial. It was what happened to the community itself. The residents of the former Whispering Oaks estates, now proudly calling themselves the Cedar Falls Neighbors, organized a real, legally recognized homeowners association. This time with proper incorporation papers, actual bylaws, and transparent accounting. And who better to lead than Beverly Chen, now their first elected president? applying the same steady discipline she once used to manage third graders to a much bigger classroom. Property values in Cedar Falls actually ticked up after Karen's downfall. Buyers, it turns out, prefer neighborhoods run by honest boards instead of professional con artists. Who could have guessed? As for the ranch, it hasn't been this healthy in decades. The cattle are thriving, the land is producing better than ever, and I've even started hosting educational tours for city families who want their kids to learn firsthand where food comes from. Watching a 7-year-old discover that milk doesn't magically appear on grocery shelves? Worth it every time. I put my settlement money from Karen's harassment case into something bigger, the Garrett Stone Community Defense Foundation. We provide free legal aid to rural families under attack from shady HOAs or predatory developers. Already we've helped more than 30 families fight back, and so far our win rate stands at 100%. Turns out most bullies fold when their victims show up with competent attorneys. The foundation also funds training programs that teach homeowners their rights, proper HOA governance, and how to spot and report organized fraud before it takes root. Because knowledge is armor, and ignorance is what predators like Karen count on. Our goal is simple. Make sure future scammers find far fewer easy victims. Dr. Martinez from the Agriculture Department has become a regular guest on the ranch, bringing her vet students to study sustainable ranching on land that's been responsibly managed for 3 generations. She says the operation is proof that agriculture and development can coexist without bulldozing family legacies. And Sheriff Morrison? He drops by every few weeks, grabs a cup of coffee, and keeps me up to date on the pulse of a community finally finding its footing again. He's still shaking his head over Karen's spectacular implosion, though he admits it was the most entertaining case of his career. Never seen anyone work so hard to build their own prosecution file, he joked to me last week. Beverly, meanwhile, has stepped into the spotlight as a local hero. She now speaks at county meetings about spotting and stopping HOA fraud. After dismantling Karen's scheme from the inside, she's become a go-to expert on governance corruption, helping reform associations across East Texas. Turns out retired teachers, when motivated, make excellent watchdogs. The most rewarding milestone came just last month when the state legislature passed the Rural Family Protection Act, a bill I helped draft. It strengthens penalties for systematic housing fraud and provides support for families targeted by land theft schemes. Ironically, Karen's criminal enterprise ended up sparking legal reforms that will shield thousands of Texans for years to come. But the sweetest victory is also the simplest. I get to drink my coffee on the porch of land that's been in my family for 70 years, listening to cattle low and meadowlarks sing, with air that smells like sage and honest work. My grandfather's legacy has weathered another storm, and it'll be here for another 70 years at least. The irony still makes me smile. Karen thought she was bullying a naive rancher who didn't know his rights. Instead, she picked a fight with someone who spent 15 years writing the very federal regulations designed to stop people like her. Her harassment campaign turned into a case study in why bullies should research their targets before declaring war. Now, every sunrise over this land reminds me of something my grandfather once wrote in his journal. If you're fighting for the right reasons with the right knowledge, you'll usually win. Karen Whitfield learned that the hard way, with nothing but time in a federal cell to reflect on her mistakes. And now I want to hear from you. Share your HOA horror stories in the comments. You might be surprised how much protection you actually have under the law. If you're stuck dealing with harassment or fraud like I was, don't suffer in silence. There are federal resources out there, and sometimes one phone call to the right office can flip the script entirely. So hit subscribe and ring the notification bell, because there are plenty more Karens out there, and their stories are coming. Remember, bullies count on ignorance, but when you know your rights and stand firm, they collapse faster than a house of cards in a Texas tornado. Knowledge is power. And power used correctly is justice. Until next time, this is Garrett Stone reminding you, fight the good fight and protect what's yours.